So let me start off by saying good afternoon and welcome to the third class of 65 Zoom hour. We've had 153 registrations from classmates, spouses, partners, and widows for this event. And the good news is that over half have already showed up, and I'm expecting a lot more by the time we really get into it. I just want to say that including the class dinner back in October and the two prior events plus this one, we've had over 700 people register for these events. So it clearly shows there's a demand for staying connected, not only during the pandemic, but just in general. I view that as a very good thing. I'm David Roscoe, and my role is to review a few technical matters before we get the event underway. But before we do that, I'd like to mention a couple of things. First, and sadly, on Monday, we heard the sad news that we lost our dear friend, Jeff Miller. He was a beloved and loyal classmate, a friend to many of us, and he'll be missed greatly. We will miss his classy ways and his sunny disposition. And I'd say if the spirit moves you, that perhaps during the social hour after the formal event, you might consider sharing a few stories and remembrances about Jeff. And our thoughts and our wishes and prayers go out to Suzanne and Jeff's family. I'd like to thank also the classmates that are making this event and all the others happen. Bob Hammond and Dennis Mack coordinate this overall series. Dave Hawkins is our featured speaker, and as Dennis will explain, 4 panelists have joined him: Duncan Brenner, Ted Garrett, Charlie Hart, and Tim Merrill. And now to the technical matters. First, you are all on mute, and that's a very good thing. It's very important. Please stay on mute unless you're called on, which you may be, in which case you can unmute yourself, speak, and then go back on mute. The reason we do this is that we don't want to hear your barking dog. And more importantly, when lots of people are on unmute, Zoom does not handle it well. There's a lot of reverberation and echo, and it just basically makes for a bad viewing experience. The second thing is, and I don't think this is much of a problem just glancing across the screen, but look at your own screen, and if it doesn't contain your real name, if it has something like the name of your iPad or whatever, then use the rename function to rename yourself. And the reason we want that to happen is you look a lot older than you did in New Haven back in 1965, and we want to know who you are. The third thing I'll mention is the chat function. At any time, starting right now, during the hour, if you have a comment or a question for Dave Hawkins, you can click on the chat button, type out your comment, and make sure that it says to everyone so that it goes out to the general thread of chats, which will be monitored by Dennis and Bob, and we will try to pick as many as we can for posing as comments or questions to Dave. I will say that we may run out of time, so don't take it personally if your chat doesn't get picked up. And finally, as a reminder, this event is being recorded, and it will be posted on the class website in a day or two for your review at your leisure after the fact. And of course, anybody that missed it, the live event, will be able to tune in later to see what they missed today. Now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dennis, who will introduce Dave and explain the whole program. Thanks.
Okay, as we welcome you to this, our third Zoom program, as David just said. And we now think that these programs are going to run indefinitely. We're getting a good response, but to keep it going, we're going to need your suggestions and volunteers to present material. We're seeking class involvement. The subject today is 5 achievable pathways to getting to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. This is a popular subject now, with many proposals being presented. Tomorrow, there will be hearings in the House on the paper that David will speak about. While today's program does not address the causes and attributions of climate change, David has recommended some links to primers on the subject. I will post those links in the chat discussions and on the class website, where the recording of the program will be available. The presentation does not address the political feasibility of putting any plan in place. There will be a link to a Yale Mason paper on politics in the chat. Our personal efforts will be necessary. If we have time, maybe classmates can talk about their own efforts, or they can do that in the breakout rooms. Our program consists of our speaker, David Hawkins, and a panel of 4 of our classmates who represent different points of view and life and work experiences. The panelists are Charlie Hart, reputed as a skeptic on climate issues; Duncan Bremer, a political conservative who is active in Colorado politics; Ted Garrett, a lawyer in a large DC law firm who has served on several environmental law committees, including as chair of the American Bar Association section on environment, energy, and resources; and Tim Merrill, who has worked in the natural gas industry. Our presenter is Dave Hawkins. David did not leave Yale expecting to crusade for the environment and climate issues. In the late 60s, David and his wife spent a summer on an island in the Bay of Nova Scotia. They fell in love with the wonders of nature. In 1970, David and others worked to produce an environmental teach-in. A New York Times article in February 1970 reporting on new youth activism on environmental issues featured a picture of David preparing for the teach-in that coming April 22nd. That teach-in was renamed Earth Day. David has been director of climate programs at the Natural Resources Defense Council since 1971, with time off for government service. He took 4 years off to serve in the Carter administration in the new Environmental Protection Agency. Upon his return, he focused on getting an improved Clean Air Act authorized by Congress in 1990. David served as the director of the NRDC's Air and Energy program, for 11 years until assuming directorship of the organization's Climate Center in 2001. With expertise in advanced coal technologies and carbon dioxide capture and storage, David served as a member of the U.S. Department of Energy's Climate Change Science Program Product Development Advisory Committee. With that, I give you David.
Thanks very much, Dennis. It's great to see all of you. Today, I'm going to summarize a study that was done by Princeton engineering discipline and scientists, released in December. It was a 2-year study. And the focus of the study is getting the United States economy decarbonized, getting it to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, 30 years from now. And I'm not going to discuss in the talk why that is a sensible target, but if people want to discuss it in the Q&A, we can do that. So let me bring up the slides and proceed. I'm going to skip over this title slide. This is just identifying the people that were involved. And the important thing about this is for me to be able to advance it. Let's see why it isn't happening. There we go. The unique thing about this study, and you may see that the screen is blocked on the right hand side. Again, if you can find the minimize button for your faces, you'll be able to see the full slide. The important thing about this study is that it doesn't pretend to advocate for one pathway to this objective of decarbonizing the economy. Instead, it has 5 different pathways that it examines, and those 5 pathways are depicted in these bar charts that are on the right-hand side of the slide. What this slide as a whole shows is the total amount of energy, what's called primary energy supply, that the U.S. economy uses to function. And 2020 is on the left-hand side, and it shows that over 80% of energy supply in the United States comes from fossil fuels today: coal, gas, and oil. Then the next bar over shows a projection for what the energy supply would look like in 2050 if we didn't make any efforts to decarbonize the economy, if it just went according to expected market conditions. And as you can see, there's not much of a change. The top blue segment of the bar is wind, and it increases as a percentage, but it's still a small part of the overall problem supply. In contrast, the 5 groups of bars to the right-hand side show what the energy mix would look like under each of these 5 pathways. And the pathways are first labeled E+, which means high electrification, where we essentially try to run on electricity virtually everything that it is technically feasible to do. Light-duty vehicles, buildings, no more natural gas in buildings, they'd all be all electric, as many industrial processes as possible. The second bar to the right is a less electrified economy. It's basically analyzing what would happen if we can't, in fact, electrify all of these different activities. The third bar is that same less electrified economy, but with an increase, a very high increase in biomass. It's possible to make energy out of biomass. We make ethanol today out of corn, and it's possible to make different forms of energy, both electricity and fuels, out of different forms of biomass, typically high energy yielding crops. The fourth pathway that the study explores is one that also has very high electrification, but a constraint on the amount of renewable energy, a constraint on the amount of wind and solar. And you can see that by looking at the size of the blue and yellow segments at the top of that bar. They are more than today, but they are less than all the other pathways. And the fifth and most right-hand end of this set of pathways is one that eliminates fossil fuels entirely from the U.S. economy and instead would run the economy on 100% renewable energy supplies. The study finds that all of these are technically feasible, and we'll go into that in a little more detail. They're challenging, but technically feasible, and they have different costs. So let's take a look at the cost. And again, here we go. So this displays the costs of these pathways in context, and the context is what do we spend on energy as a percentage of our gross domestic product? And it goes back to 1970, and as you can see, in 1970, we spent about 8% of our gross domestic product on energy costs. At the time of the Iranian Revolution and the oil embargo, the costs skyrocketed as a percentage up to 14% because of the high oil cost and our high dependence on oil. And then it plummeted again between then and the year 2000, and then it went up again when we had the financial crisis, mostly because the energy cost didn't go down all that much, but our GDP did. And as you can see today in 2020, we are around a little less than 5% of our GDP is spent on energy. The forecast going out to 2050 is, not surprisingly, under the reference case where we don't do anything to try to change the energy system. They would drop further to about 3.25%. And then it shows the 5 pathways costs. And those costs as a percent of GDP are all clustered between 4.5% and 5.5%. So the point that the Princeton authors make is that while these zero carbon energy systems will cost more than doing nothing in terms of energy costs, they are at or below much of the percentage that we have spent on energy costs in the U.S. economy in the recent past. The next thing to talk about is what these pathways have in common. As I said, there are 5 different pathways, but they all have some things in common. The first is that there's a huge amount of energy efficiency, more efficient buildings, more efficient appliances, more efficient vehicles, more efficient industrial processes, and a huge amount of electrification, so that where we're using direct oil, gas, or coal today, we try to electrify it. The second element, which is connected at the hips to the first element, is transitioning to clean electricity. Because if you're trying to get zero carbon, if you electrify and don't have clean electricity sources, then you aren't going to get very far. So it calls for a large expansion in wind and solar generation. It calls for transmission to be able to move that electricity from where the wind and solar farms and biomass facilities are to the energy load centers, the major metropolitan areas. And importantly, it calls for retention of existing power generating facilities that are capable of sending out supplies of electricity no matter what the weather is, no matter what the time of day is. The third element is an increased reliance on biomass for energy production, as well as some other zero carbon fuels, which I will mention. The fourth element is a technology called carbon capture and storage. We use this today at a certain number of industrial facilities in order to supply CO2 to the oil industry to get oil out of depleting oil fields. But in general, most sources of CO2 don't use carbon capture. Why? For the very simple reason that it costs money and they're not required to by any regulation. But this is a technology that is expected to play a significant role in decarbonizing the economy. The fifth element is that CO2, while it's the major greenhouse gas, is not the only greenhouse gas. And we need to pay attention to reducing methane, to reducing hydrofluorocarbons, long-lived chemicals that destroy the ozone layer, but also increase global warming, and nitrous oxides, which is also a global warming gas. And the sixth is to do what Mother Nature is already doing for us, which is carbon stores that are in soils and in forests and in vegetation that we don't harvest. There's a significant amount of annual uptake of carbon in those land sinks, as they're called. Not enough to compensate for continuing to use fossil fuels at the rate we're using them, but a significant amount, and increasing that will help. Okay. I mentioned solar and wind as cornerstones. So let's take a quicker look at that. Again, on the left-hand side of the screen, you will see the reference case scenario. And the top three pieces of the area curve, there's a very thin slice of green, a thicker slice of light blue, and a thicker and a slice of yellow. That is offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar. As you can see in the reference case, they all increase, but fossil fuels still dominate. In contrast, in all the five clean energy paths, the amount of wind and solar increased dramatically. If you can't see it, the x-axis is time, with 2020 on the left-hand side of each bar graph, each area graph, and 2050. So it covers a 30-year time span in each one of these five pathways. And the authors put in a vertical line to show you how quickly we have to expand wind and solar in the next 10 years. So that's the amount of wind and solar that is needed to be online in 2030 in terms of annual generation of electricity. And as you can see, it's a large increase in all of these scenarios, except the scenario that is the next to the last on the right, which is the constrained renewable scenario, where renewable energy does not deploy any faster than the recent growth rates. And finally, on the extreme right is the scenario where you have zero fossil fuels, and you can see the really dramatic increase in renewable energy that would be required in the last 20 years or so, 15 years of this 30-year period. Now, let's examine that a little bit as well. What this chart shows is the annual build rate in terms of gigawatts of capacity. A gigawatt is a very large fossil fuel power plant or a large nuclear plant. It's a big power plant. And what the reference case shows is that you would need to build less than 50 gigawatts per year, even out in 2050, of wind and solar in order to meet energy demands. In contrast, the build rate for wind and solar in the E+ scenario is 150 gigawatts a year out in the last 5-year period, 2045 to 2050. Over 200 gigawatts a year in the next scenario during that 5-year period, over 150, and skipping to the very last, the zero fossil fuel scenario, over 350 gigawatts per year in the last 5 years of this 30-year marathon. Now, that compares to these bar charts on the right-hand side. And as you can see, China, in its peak year of renewable energy, wind and solar building, built about 84 gigawatts of wind and solar. The United States, which is the next collection of bars, built about 35 gigawatts of wind and solar. And the world as a whole built about 180 gigawatts of wind and solar. So what this is showing is that the United States would have to do a hell of a lot of work. As I say, the Princeton authors say it's feasible, but what they want to point out is you're not going to get there by proceeding at the current pace. You'd have to pick up the pace a lot, and it would be a big undertaking. This is a map view of what the wind and solar infrastructure would look like. Here's what it looks like today. And those little blue dots are the current wind farms in the United States. These lines are the current transmission capacity. There is some solar capacity on here which doesn't show up very well in 2020. But skipping to 2050, you can see the change, and it's dramatic. All of these blue blobs are new wind farms. The thick lines are the new transmission that would have to be added. And over here on the East Coast are offshore wind farms. This is a very detailed analysis, and one of the things that's unique about the Princeton study is that they actually dug down and did this kind of granular work. The basic point is there'd be a lot of renewable capacity that would be required, and you can see a rough depiction of where their economic models show that it would be likely to be located. So moving to the next slide. This gets to the non-renewable part, or the non-wind and solar part of this energy solution. As I mentioned, the authors do not propose to eliminate what I'll call conventional generation. Generation like nuclear power, like today's natural gas power plants. Coal plants basically do disappear under all of these scenarios, but there is this portion of these graphs that are below the blue and the yellow, which is the wind and solar, are the remaining conventional, or what they call firm capacity that can be turned on whenever the power grid needs it, because there isn't adequate amounts of wind and solar. Now, I say turned on, and that's turned on if electric planners do their job right. And as we saw in Texas earlier this week, electric planners don't always do their jobs right. So Texas has a huge amount of natural gas capacity, but about a third of it didn't turn on. And why didn't it turn on? It didn't turn on because the valves were frozen, and because natural gas electric utilities in Texas buy their gas on the spot market. They don't have contracts for that natural gas. And so the users of natural gas, residents, commercial, industrial, that do have firm contracts, they got the gas, and the power plants stopped operating. Some wind turbines also did not operate during the cold snap. Why is that? It's not because wind turbines aren't capable of operating in cold climates. They are. We have a lot of them in the northern part of the United States, and in Canada, and in other countries. But those wind turbines, the utilities sensibly procured packages that included cold weather operational features. The Texas utilities didn't do that because regulators don't require them to do it, and because it cost more to buy that package than to not buy the package. And they thought, based on your grandfather's climate, that, hey, it doesn't get cold very often in Texas. We don't need that. Well, guess what? We do. Let me now switch to the biomass question. In all of these scenarios, there's a substantial amount of bioenergy, and what this what these proposals call for is taking land that is currently being used to grow corn for ethanol, and instead growing other high energy crops and producing other more efficient fuels and producing electricity. And because crops are not very energy dense, you don't want to transport them for hundreds of miles. So that means that you're going to need a system where the conversion facilities, the plants that convert crops into energy, have to be located fairly close to where the crops are grown. And this simply depicts a hypothetical scenario in 2050 where there are hundreds of biomass energy production plants that would be gathering crops and converting them using various techniques. Again, a change in the landscape. The next topic is carbon capture and storage. This is a busy slide, so let me just point out a few things. The different pathways use different amounts of carbon capture and storage. At the high end, some of the pathways would use almost 2 gigatons. A gigaton is 1 billion tons. Capture about almost 2 billion tons of CO2 per year. That compares to today's CO2 emissions from fuel combustion in the United States of about 6 billion tons. So you're looking at something on the order of 20% under that high-end scenario. Under the low-end scenario, it would be 100 million tons on the low-end pathway. And another 900 million tons that would be sequestered. So the top part of these slides show where the CO2 is captured from, and these big green segments are bioenergy. So the idea is you grow the crops, which take CO2 out of the air, you then convert them into energy, and the energy, the part of the carbon in the crops that doesn't go into the energy is captured and is, in these cases, stored underground in geologic formation. That results in a net negative term of actually reducing, not just reducing emissions, but reducing the amount of CO2 that's already in the air. And that would compensate for any existing use of fossil fuels in the scenarios that contemplate continued use of fossil fuels. Now, over here on the right-hand side is the scenario of the zero fossil fuel economy. And there, all of the captured CO2 does not get put into geologic formations. Instead, it gets turned into synthetic fuels to replace the fossil fuels that are no longer being used. That would be, for example, in the aviation sector. To make this CO2 scenario work, you need to move the CO2 from where it's captured to where it will either be where it'll be injected or supplied to markets in the form of synthetic fuels. And this network shows, the green dots show where the biomass production facilities are, and then the big thick lines are the CO2 pipelines. And these gray areas are the geologic formations. Fortunately, in the United States, we have an abundance of suitable geologic formations for permanent storage of injected CO2. A huge amount in the Gulf Coast, and basically this suggests that the Gulf Coast is going to continue to be a big energy sector and big energy center, even in a decarbonized economy. Getting to that, one of the things that the study examined was the impact on employment in the energy sector. And these boxes depict the states in the continental United States. Here's on the left-hand side, top row is Washington State, then Oregon, then California behind it. So a rough approximation of the United States. Now the bars that are inside these boxes depict what the energy-related employment is relative to current energy-related employment. And it shows it for 3 decades. The current decade out to 2030, the middle bar is 2030 to 2040, and the right-hand bar is 2040 to 2050. The colors signify the following. Yellow is within 15% of today's employment in the energy sector. The green is a greater than 15% increase relative to today. And the red, which occurs in 2 states, Louisiana and West Virginia, is a drop of energy-related employment of more than 15%. Basically, what this depicts is that energy-related employment for the United States as a whole is not going to go down, it will go up. And a couple of states will have reductions in energy-related employment, which will require some form of transition to avoid having an economic downturn in the state as a whole. The next topic that that the authors looked at were health impacts. While CO2 doesn't have any direct health impacts, other than if you have enough of it, you can asphyxiate yourself, but we're far below those levels. But the pollutants that are associated with the CO2 emitting sources do have health impacts. And so what the authors looked at was the impact on two sources of health impacts today: premature deaths from coal plants and premature deaths from motor vehicles. What this shows is that on the upper map, the redder the color, the greater the number of deaths per county there are. And you can see a cluster in the northeastern United States, the Great Lakes states, the Southwest, and in Florida, a significant number of deaths due to today's operating coal plants. The bottom chart shows deaths associated with motor vehicles. Most of the country is in pretty good shape, as indicated by this dark blue. But in California, there still are death hotspots, if you will. Again, in Florida, and in the eastern half of the United States. Not quite as intense, but nonetheless a significant health impact due to motor vehicles. Then we go to 2050, and essentially coal plant health impacts are eliminated because coal plants are eliminated. And motor vehicle health impacts are also eliminated, not because we've eliminated motor vehicles, but because we have shifted to ways of powering those motor vehicles that don't have health impacts, either electric drive or synthetic fuels that are not fossil fuel based and don't have the pollutants associated with them. And by the way, they quantified this. The premature deaths avoided from this transition would be 200,000 to 300,000 through 2050, which they assign an economic value of $2 to $3 trillion in damages avoided. Making this transition is going to require spending money. It's going to require a capital investment in the next decade of $2.5 trillion more than we otherwise would spend. And that expenditure is broken down in this chart. The electric sector would require another $830 billion of expenditure, about half of that for wind farms and about a little less than half of it for solar farms. The electric transportation, networks to move energy and CO2 around is going to cost require an investment of $530 billion, with 350 in electric transmission and a little over 100 million in CO2 pipelines. Then we have energy efficiency in the building sector, energy efficiency in and electrification in the vehicles sector, industrial energy efficiency, as well as fuel conversion. And finally, down here in the lower right-hand corner, some expenditures on RD&D to facilitate faster innovation for stuff that we aren't able to imagine today, but could be a help. So $2.5 trillion, which they've analyzed as falling into these big buckets. Getting close to the end here. This is what they set as the things that are going to happen in the 2020s. So if we want to have this transition occur by 2050, We can't wait to start. We have to do work in the next 10 years. And the first item of work is socialization, creating social structures that will recognize the value of doing this, that will invest in communities that are transitioning away from fossil fuels, and generally setting up institutions that will make these kinds of changes possible. The second key element is energy efficiency. The third key element is the electrification of everything that we're capable of electrifying. The fourth key activity is starting the decarbonization. That means replacing existing generation from fossil fuels with wind and solar at an accelerating rate. And the fifth is starting to build out the bioenergy economy. We don't have, other than the ethanol economy, we don't have these bioenergy conversion plants today. We know how to build them. We know what the technology is. We have technology called the Fischer-Tropsch process that goes back to the 1930s, and it is used in some niche applications today, and would be the backbone of a bioenergy economy. Then we have to build out the networks. It's not an easy job to build transmission. It's not an easy job to build pipelines. It needs to start decades ahead of when you want it to be complete. 7, work on enhancing land sinks. There's lots that can be done to enhance soil carbon sequestration, and lots that can be done to reduce the harm to forests. And finally, attention to innovation. The last slides in my presentation have a lot more detail on each of these items. I'm not going to go into them. I'll just leave you with a final slide. Last week, the National Academy of Sciences put out a report on the same topic of accelerating decarbonization, and again looked at the objective of getting the US economy to zero net carbon emissions by 2050. The link to that is here on the slide. For those of you who don't take screenshots or are not fast enough to write it down, it will be posted after this session. And with that, I am going to turn it back to whoever the MC is and stop screen sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We'll now turn this over to our panel. You did a fabulous job being so quick. You cut a lot of time out of that. Congratulations. Panel?
So let me start off briefly thanking Dave. I think it's a fascinating study, and I love the fact that it is just plain dealing with the sort of the economics of the situation, how much of this and how much of that, as opposed to the politics, which we certainly could get into, but I think that's a topic for a different day that maybe we will do. So much as I'm constrained on that, I want to make a couple of comments. One is that in the 70s, we were all pursuing renewable energy because we were going to run out of fossil fuel. We weren't going to have it by 2020 or pick whatever date. And then in the 80s, it was, we were pursuing fossil fuels domestically because we wanted energy independence. And we were scared about being dependent on the Middle East. Now we have energy independence. We're not buying a lot of foreign energy. We're actually exporting a lot of energy. We've got an abundant supply of fossil fuels, and the energy costs are at historic lows, as David showed. So I think there's a gremlin out there that hates fossil fuels, because now we hate fossil fuels because they're going to change our climate. And that's certainly debatable by some people, but again, we're not going to do that for purposes of this conversation. We're going to accept that this is a goal, and if it's a worthy goal or an unworthy goal, that's another story, but how do we get there is what this study shows. And I think it's quite commendable because of its granularity and essentially probably neutrality. So a question on a couple of areas that have been brought up or talked about. First off, this is just dealing with the U.S. economy. Obviously, we have to deal with the economy on a global scale if we're trying to deal with global temperatures, global climate change. What we do in the U.S. is only a small part of the overall potential achievement. It's important to note that this is a part, not and maybe a significant part. It's certainly the ones that most of us have our interest in because we're Americans, but it is only a part. So one comment I'd like to see David address is, what part is this of the whole? If the U.S. does this, and you have a do nothing scenario in the rest of the world, what's been accomplished? So you want to go ahead and address that?
Sure, rather than hold things up. So yeah, it's sort of the what about China question. And the U.S. is about a quarter of the world greenhouse gas emissions. It's second after China. Historically, it's still number one. China overtook the United States only recently. The interesting thing about China is that while it's still a dirty economy today, it is betting its future on becoming a marketer of clean energy technologies. It is the world's largest producer of wind turbines. It is the world's largest producer of solar solar panel installations. And it is standing up a number of electric vehicle companies that it intends it's going to market to the rest of the world. So China is headed in the direction that of decarbonizing. Its commitments are ones that are not as strong as they need to be. But I think the direction is pretty clear. India is another big country, and its leaders are still kind of stuck on the perception that they can't do without a lot of new fossil fuel investment. But just in the last few years, the costs of solar in particular have dropped so much that they're changing their energy planning to recognize the fact that it's actually going to spur economic development in India to rely more heavily on solar rather than relying on new coal-fired power plants. So you need, you really, we've got 190 countries or so, but to solve the climate problem, we need only a handful of groups. We need the United States, we need China, we need India, we need the EU, and we need the rest of growing Asia, which will probably follow China's lead. The rest of the world could move more slowly, and we would still be able to get a handle on this problem.
That's great, thank you, good answer. Question, what is it, 2.5 trillion additional investment in the next decade, and that's is that included in the energy cost diagram that it says it's only 4.5% of GDP, or is that on top of that?
No, that is if you spend $2.5 trillion extra in the next 10 years to put in place these new energy systems, you will have lower operating costs, which will net out to a percentage of gross domestic product in that 4.5 to 5.5% range. So you're basically investing in technologies that have lower operating costs, because obviously the wind and solar generation have zero operating costs. You have to replace the turbines every so often, but once you've invested in the capital equipment, you get to amortize it over a long period of time and generate a lot of kilowatt hours that have zero operating costs.
So I guess I'm a little confused still. So is that amortized over the, let's say, the 10-year period that you're doing this investment, or?
No, it's amortized over the life of the investments, which will typically be 30 years or so.
Okay, so that clarifies that. Let's see. Were a couple of people mentioned in the chat and in some questions about nuclear, and I think as a part of that, traditional nuclear and the possibility of fission. It seems to me when we were in college, the hope was we were going to get fusion by 2050 or some date. So I wonder if you could comment on traditional nuclear and fusion in relation to this study.
Yeah, all of these pathways assume that most of today's nuclear power plants continue to operate through 2050 and beyond. They do not assume any new power plant starts, but obviously one could do an analysis that did assume that. But it does assume that there's some significant contribution from nuclear power plants. As far as fusion goes, it's perennially 30 years in the future. It was there when we were in college. It's still 30 years in the future.
It's a fascinating technology. Maybe it'll happen. But this was all based on.
Some would point out that we do have a fusion reactor. It's called the sun.
Yeah. So I'm curious about the biofuels and carbon uptake. Both of those. You talked about enhancing or increasing carbon uptake and therefore being able to store it in soils. I have a client who's in that business or trying to get into that business. I guess I'm just a little skeptical that we can, take up more carbon by growing more things. Is it different feeds? Is it different biological inventions, or what are we doing there?
Well, there are two different issues. One is soil carbon content. Agricultural practices have degraded the amount of soil carbon content of the soil over the years. And there are things that can be done, such as no-till agriculture, other forms of cropping practices that can increase the amount of carbon that's retained in the soil. And the agriculture department is working on socializing those ideas. Farmers have to be convinced that it's going to work, that it's not going to cut into their yield, that it's worth the hassle. So that's not necessarily a rapid process, but it is something underway. The other is being more careful about how we manage forests. There are a lot of degraded forest lands that with more care could retain more carbon in those forests. Now, it's important to note that forests are wonderful things, regardless of whether there's a global warming problem or carbon retention. They're a huge source of ecosystem diversity and habitat preservation. But forests are, as we've seen with the California wildfires, vulnerable to climate disruption. And they can, if they burn, they release their carbon. So there is a bit of a Faustian proposition here. You don't want to create a huge stock of new forests unless you controlled the major driver of climate change, because you've essentially built yourself a lot of kindling. And we don't want to do that. But if this is done in an integrated fashion, maybe 15% of the job could be handled through increased carbon uptake in vegetation that we don't harvest prairie grasses, for example, on degraded lands, as well as the soil carbon increase.
Okay, let's move now to Ted.
Very good. Can you hear me now?
Where did Ted go?
First, Dave, thanks so much for doing this and for all of your efforts in this really important area. It's a critical area for our future, for ourselves and for our kids and for our grandkids. So thank you very much and congratulations for all of your accomplishments in the area. You and I and others in the class went to law school before the real dawn of modern federal environmental law. I know when I went to law school, there were no courses in environmental law, although the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, just a couple of years after I got out of law school. But back in the day, we were worried about more conventional pollutants like particulates and lead and so forth. I remember fussing around with something called the bubble concept, which Clean Air Act groupies would know about. But fast forward, I know my practice, my firm's practice now focuses on climate change, and I think we're in a new world. And thank you for focusing our attention on this. I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask you about. First of all, focusing on baseload issues. As we all know, wind and solar, although they're enormously promising, they're weather dependent. And so you need a base load of some kind. Putting aside nuclear for a minute, I wanted to ask you about biomass versus oil and gas with CCS. And I was interested in the very first slide you presented, showing what the effects are of high energy efficiency. And it looked as though if you could achieve very high energy efficiency so that overall need for electricity was a little bit lower, that with wind and solar that you needed less of a base load. I'm wondering what your thoughts are with respect to biomass versus oil and gas with CO2 capture. In other words, if one lags, the other one can make the difference, and a lot of investment needs to be made. Do you have any thoughts about where we ought to be placing our bets or incentives as between those options?
I do, and I prefer gas to biofuels generally. Why? My experience is that agriculture, both in the U.S. and in other places, is still practiced in a way that has a lot of harmful environmental side effects. And when I look at the politics of imposing environmental standards on agriculture, at least in my 50 years of experience, every time we've tried to do something significant to improve the environmental performance of agriculture, agriculture has usually won that fight. And we have not succeeded. And I think that a bioenergy economy is more likely to follow that path than the nirvana of everybody is now an adherent to the Church of Ecology. I just think that the agriculture industry is not going to go away. It's going to be powerful. So I'd rather actually rely on natural gas for that firm power. Now that's a controversial position, and there are a lot of people in the environmental community that disagree with that. But natural gas with carbon capture and storage it can be a low carbon electric resource. And interestingly, with some tweaks, the same equipment that burns natural gas can also burn an increasing amount of hydrogen. And if that hydrogen is produced in a green fashion, and we have the technology to do it, it's not economic today, but we have the technology to produce hydrogen that doesn't have any fossil carbon in it. You take the, 20 seconds, you take the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere using demonstrated carbon capture techniques, and you combine it with hydrogen that is made by electrolysis, where wind and solar run the electricity needed to split water into hydrogen and oxygen. You mix that together and you have a synthetic fuel that can be dropped into power plants, can be dropped into aircraft, and it has zero fossil carbon in it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I had some of the impressions just reading that Princeton report and from other sources and a podcast that I heard by one of the authors indicating that biomass had some problems in terms of the amount of land that would be needed and sort of other assumptions involving it that practically and maybe politically would be difficult. Let me ask you another question about nuclear energy. Duncan mentioned that, but the assumptions in the Princeton study seem to be that nuclear power would kind of stay at the same level, but we wouldn't be having any significant increase in plants in that area. But there's been a lot of effort toward different kinds of nuclear facilities, some smaller reactors. And I don't know if you saw this a star in a bottle sort of New Yorker article in February about a plant being built by the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor folks in France. Apparently a huge amount of money has been put into it, and they have some optimism, and maybe this is another sort of 30-year issue, but that although it's been shown theoretically in the laboratory that it's possible to do something on a commercial scale, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are, putting maybe that aside for a bit, about increasing our nuclear capability in the country as part of the base load increase.
So personally, I think we ought to spend somewhat more money than we currently are on advanced nuclear technologies, small modular reactors. We need to improve the management of the current programs. We're spending a lot of money today, but it really hasn't produced much, even though we've been spending it for decades. But personally, I think the option value, as we say, of having a safe, affordable nuclear technology is so large that I think it's worth spending some money to see whether it's possible to deliver. Again, that's a controversial opinion. I'm probably the only one in my organization of 700 people who feels that way.
Okay, well, I know that there's been a lot of resistance in the environmental community, and maybe that's one of several reasons why we haven't seen new nuclear plants go online in the last 20 or 30 years, in addition to the costs and other problems.
There I disagree. I think the reason we haven't seen them go online has almost nothing to do with environmental opposition. It's all about financing. You can't build these things because no one will finance them. You know, there were 2 nuclear reactors under construction in the past decade in this country. One of them dropped out because of huge cost overruns, and the managers of that are now under indictment in South Carolina. The other one is still going because it is being built by a regulated utility that has captive customers. Its customers can't say no, and that's why it's being built.
All right. Well, I won't spar further with you on that subject. Let me ask you another question now, and going back to, and you would sort of be, I'm sure have views on this with your experience as a regulator and also with NRDC. The traditional Clean Air Act approach is what we call sort of command and control. The government, you know, there's a law, there are regulations, and then you have enforcement. Climate change puts us in a sort of a new world, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are about market forces and, in particular, incentives. You know, to some extent, natural gas has supplanted coal because it's cheaper. And companies sort of are on their own as a matter of economics have switched to natural gas for that reason. But I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the role of incentives like a carbon tax or rebates or subsidies and the like to spur industry and public support and investment.
Well, I prefer pollution metrics as the policy objective, tons of carbon. So I prefer an objective that says let's have an obligation to get to zero carbon in the economy and have declining emission performance standards for major sectors. I prefer that over the economic instruments, but if Congress were to move forward with a good carbon pricing or carbon tax bill, I wouldn't be arguing against it. Good means that it would have to be strong enough to actually do the job. And that's where you get into a political problem. Because when you're talking about a tax bill, the indicator of political merit is how low is the tax. The lower the tax, the easier it is to sell the package. Well, that's the exact opposite of what you'd need if that's going to be your primary policy instrument.
Okay, let's move now to Charlie.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, I'm the resident skeptic apparently, and recruited for this endeavor by Dennis, who woke me out of a nice nap on a Sunday afternoon, so I'm kind of pissed off about the whole thing. I'm not really a skeptic that greenhouse gases are a problem. I'm a skeptic as to whether any of these things proposed will ever take place in the magnitude required. This is a colossal undertaking, and I think those of you that saw Bill Gates on 60 Minutes begin to get an indication of just what is required. I've always been a fan of nuclear energy. I have never understood why it takes such a long time and a great expense to build, design, license, and so forth a nuclear plant where you can do it in about 3 years if you wrap an aircraft carrier around it. That strikes me as a great opportunity for somebody to investigate. And while I'm speaking of investigation, a project of this magnitude, and David, you cleverly glossed over about 1,000 things that need to be done in order to accomplish this net zero program. And my guess is that the chance of that happening as described is less than zero. And my view is if you're going to do something like this, a major activity involving everybody in the United States, you need to resurrect Lee Iacocca or find somebody like that who can muster up motivation for people to actually consider changing. Anyway, I thought about this for a while. My primary interest is energy. I thought about a lot of things that have to do with this. And so I started to Google, which is creating a lot of problem for those of you listening because of the high probability that I've screwed up some conversion or decimal place. But here's a few fun facts I found. In the by the way, Dave, you mentioned something like 50 gigawatts of wind power. That's about 20,000 turbines under current technology, because a wind turbine generates about 2.5 megawatts. The United States uses 4 million gigawatts annually, about 3/4 of which is fossil fuel. That means to replace or reduce 3 million gigawatts is the order of business. And to do that, you only need 1 billion wind turbines, which means you have to build 30 million of them every year for the next 30 years to get to 2050. Now, obviously, nobody is going to propose 100% wind power. That's a stupid idea, but it does illustrate, I think, the magnitude of change and effort required to implement these kinds of programs. And I am certainly in no position, knowledge-wise or otherwise, to make much sense out of a great deal of what, Dave, you proposed. I think it's a magnificent presentation, and I'm very happy to be part of this. But I hope it's not a bill of goods. I hope we can find a Lee Iacocca someplace, dredge him up while we're dumping CO2 in the ground. Maybe we can resurrect the guy and have him lead this parade or somebody like that, because if I'm listening to Scandinavian teenagers or aristocratic swamp dwellers, I'm not real impressed with the likelihood of success. And that is my skepticism. Tim, back to you, sir.
Charlie, well done. Do you want
Thank
me to, David, Dennis, do you want me just to weigh in here?
Yes. Unless David wants to say something to Charlie.
Just one quick comment. Charlie, you're absolutely right to pinpoint the effort that's required to scale up, and that's one of the reasons I spent time on the slide that showed the annual build rate. You know, they've analyzed this in detail, and you basically, in order to meet these recipes, you would have to build something like twice the annual average that China built last year. So can we do twice as well as China? I think so.
Sure. Yeah, let me finish with just a couple of things. If you want to see what a wind farm looks like, a big one, head up from Indianapolis to Chicago through the Fowler Ridge one, where you got 10 miles on a side and about 400 wind turbines. That's what people who live in a wind turbine area are going to face, and I will submit to you that that's going to take a big selling job. The second thing is for 70 years we've sent our young people for months on end in a contained environment next to a nuclear reactor in the Navy, and as far as I know, there's not a single, not one problem associated with that. We've lost 2 nuclear submarines, but nobody's quite sure why that is. So that's enough of my soapbox.
Okay, Tim.
Well, I'm an energy guy, and I've made most of my career dealing with natural gas. And like, perhaps I had my eye on the wrong target. I've argued with many people, including Bob Hammond's wife, that drilling for natural gas and completing gas wells by fracturing, thank you, not fracking, but fracturing, is not inherently damaging to the environment. And what I was thinking about, of course, was water pollutions primarily. And I remain convinced that we drill and complete gas wells without an inherent detrimental impact on the environment. But I was perhaps not focusing on the right issue, which is climate change and methane leaks in our environment because of our use of natural gas. So I was interested to hear David's comments earlier with regard to the role of natural gas going forward. I still think it is a bridge fuel, but maybe not as important as I long thought. But I want to sort of conclude and ask for David's comments, because in getting ready for this presentation, he referred us to a book, us panelists, to a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass. And this is sweetgrass. And it's all around us, and when it's cut, it can be braided. You see the braid, you see the cut and the braids. And as it so happens in our house, we have a little box of braided sweetgrass. This is a beautiful book written by an Indigenous American. It's about climate change, but it's a collection of essays that are just wonderful. And David, I'd ask, how did you come across this book? And do you recommend, like I do, that everybody on this Zoom meeting pick up this book and read it tomorrow? You're on, David.
I do recommend the book. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. I just came across it in browsing somewhere, got it, read it, and was so moved by it that I gave it to my 3 grown children. And we have a brand new, now 20-month-old granddaughter, our first. And I wrote to the author and said, if I send you a copy of the book, would you write something to my new granddaughter? Because I just relish the thought of her reading this at some point in the future and reading the words of the author. And she was nice enough to do that. And it is a beautiful book. And I'll take another 30 seconds. The title is Braiding Sweetgrass, but the book itself is a braid. It's braiding three different
Yes.
disciplines. It's braiding Western science, it's braiding indigenous knowledge, and it's braiding family, specifically motherhood. And she has these essays of these three different aspects of her life: Western science, indigenous knowledge, and being a mother. And they're braided together, and it's really a wonderful book.
In one essay, just as a teaser, she takes a bunch of students up into the Smoky Mountains and to teach them about the names of various flora and to some degree fauna. And she's sort of unhappy with herself because it's too technical. She doesn't think they really get it. And so they're coming down from the mountains, and she's leading this group of 6 or 7 students or whatever, and she hears them break into the song For All the Saints. Beautiful moment for all the saints and the wording of all the saints. It's a wonderful book.
So,
Thank you, David.
Back to the mundane topic of decarbonizing the United States.
Well, we have a huge list of questions from our classmates, and we're actually running out of time. One person raised an issue about the cost of manufacturing all these things. Wouldn't that, in essence, produce a lot of demand put a lot of carbon in the air, manufacturing all the equipment you have to build?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to do a full life cycle analysis, and those life cycle analyses have been done. We're going to have to, the economist Kenneth Boulding a number of years ago wrote a book called Spaceship Earth. And he basically said, we're going to have to transition from the cowboy economy, the wide open spaces, to the spaceship economy. We have done such a brilliant job as a species of expanding our power over the planet we live on that we're actually approaching its functioning capabilities. And so we have to recognize that we've actually, created a spaceship out of what used to be a cowboy economy. So we're going to have to do much more in the way of recycling and be inventive about that and develop design. There's another great book by a guy named Bill McDonough, who has written a book called From Cradle to Cradle, and it's all about design with reuse in mind at the very start of the design process. So yeah, we'll do a lot of that, and it will reduce our footprint on the earth.
Okay, Bob, do you have the next question?
Yes. I think with Steve Clark wanted to know the downsides of subterranean CO2 storage. Will this affect the aquifer and our water supply?
Yeah, this is a question that I asked. I asked when I first learned about this topic. Now going on 20 years ago, and I actually wrote a little paper called "Stick It Where." I was skeptical about whether we knew enough, and luckily I got the assignment of being a review editor for a group of scientists that were writing a special report on carbon capture and storage. And I was put in charge of reviewing, just for comprehension, the chapter on geologic storage. So I got to hang out over the course of a couple of years with probably a dozen of the world's preeminent geologists on this topic. And I came away convinced that we know how to do this safely. We're going to need regulation to make sure it is done safely, But the interesting thing that tends to convince people is, guess why we have oil and gas deposits? They were formed hundreds of millions of years ago. Why do we still have them? Because they didn't leak. The geology exists to keep in place these kinds of compounds in formations. And one other thing I'll say is that people have a misconception that injecting CO2 underground is like finding a big cavern and just pumping in gas and hope that you don't pump in so much gas that it pops the cavern. Well, that's not the concept. The CO2 is compressed into a liquid, a supercritical liquid, and then it is injected into porous sandstone formations, which to you and me look like rock, but they have a lot of pore space. They have huge amounts of pores that can be filled up with these supercritical fluids. And those fluids need to be carefully, you have to find the right formation. So you have to find sandstone that's about a mile below the surface of the earth, and it has to be overlain by an impermeable layer, which is shale. And if you find that combination, you've got a safe combination to inject CO2. And fortunately, the US, China, and other places have huge formations that could, if we decided we wanted to, store several hundred years worth of fossil fuel emissions. Now, we'd be nuts to store that much, but there is a lot of space.
Okay. Another question is there any likelihood of new methods of transmission of electricity? Are we stuck with the Edison model?
Well, the one thing we can do is have high voltage DC lines, which reduces loss. And we don't have large networks of that today, and we will need them. And it does pose a sociological issue, which is the economics of high voltage DC lines is that you don't want a lot of offtake points. You know, it's like an interstate highway where you don't want an interchange every half a mile. You want the offtake points to be relatively few and far between, which means you have to have some deal to offer to the communities where they get the transmission line, but the electricity comes back to them, you know, from some distant location. So that's going to take some wheeling and dealing and political ingenuity.
A last question. Chip Marshall wrote in. He said, I have a $20,000 proposal to put solar on my house. Is this worthwhile, or is this just symbolic action to make me feel good?
Neither. It is, well, it is worthwhile. We spent $20,000 to put solar on our house. We're saving about $800 a year. So you can figure out the payback period. If we were doing this purely as an economic proposition, I could have made a lot more money by putting it in the stock market. But it does save you some money. It's not a fast payback period, and it does provide you with a pathway that can lower your footprint. Most of the solar that's in this study is not on rooftop solar. It's large, what's called utility scale solar, which has much greater efficiency. But the solar costs are coming down. Interestingly, the biggest expense of the solar nowadays is not the panel cost, it's the cost of the installation. You know, we had 5 people here 3 days putting these panels on our roof. That was a huge part of the overall cost.
Well, let me add a comment. Way back in the 70s, I was working for the AIA on some research, and one of the projects I asked the principal researcher He was modeling various different passive solar operations in non-residential buildings. And I said, what are you finding out? And he said, it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you do it in Colorado. So where you do it makes a lot of difference. I talk about heat pumps a lot in this, and heat pumps are great in marginal climates where you need both air conditioning, cooling, as well as heating. They're much less efficient if you have a high heating demand and virtually no cooling demand. So the technologies make a huge difference depending upon where you are in our very large country.
Yep.
Okay, we're really coming to an end here. There are a huge number of questions, and Bob Hammond is now going to put a temporary good farewell on this and announce a poll.
Okay, this was a phenomenal program. It came off, I only can describe this in superlative terms. It came out so great. I want to thank all the panelists who put in a lot of thought and effort to coming up with significant statements, reflecting themselves as individuals and thinking about the issues as a whole. You guys did a phenomenal job. I thought the format worked great. Dave, I can't thank you enough, both for this presentation and your entire life and career in public policy about clean air and the environment. We are all very proud of you and can't say enough about it. I have a Dave Hawkins quote. He said in a podcast, you have to address urgent priorities, but you also have to leave some space to consider emerging problems before they become urgent priorities. Dave Roscoe is going to put up, this was a great session. We have questions coming out our ears here from submissions and chat lines. Dave Roscoe is going to put up a poll to ascertain whether or not there's sufficient interest to have another session at a later date about this topic and climate change. It should be on your screen. If you would just tap definitely yes, possibly yes, no, we're not sure, we'll take it under advisement. And I can't, hosts and panelists cannot vote. All right, I see that.
It's scary getting this instant feedback.
We're going to go from here to the breakout sessions, right?
Well, yes.
Okay.
Just
Dave,
explain.
for people who want to hang around and chat socially for another 10 minutes or so, Dave will break us up into random breakout session groups in small numbers. Each group will run for about 10 minutes. If you're interested in doing it, just hang on and Dave will come back to us. Over to you, Dave.
Okay, well, fantastic job by all involved. The meeting is formally over, so there's no shame in leaving if you have another commitment. Not a problem. If you want to stick around and enjoy a social time with your classmates, okay.